For folks who aren't familiar, we're speaking with Kurt Hackbarth, who is a journalist based in Mexico. And we're going to be talking a little bit about AMLO, these upcoming elections, and a few other things regarding Mexico. And I think these conversations are really important because despite Mexico being, one of our neighbors, a lot of American leftists are pretty mystified as to what's going on politically in Mexico. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. But just to set the stage a little bit, and I think most of the people who listen to the show will be familiar. But I just want to take a quick stroll down memory lane. Right. For folks who don't remember, when AMLO first gets elected in Mexico, there is a collective freak out in American media, including some really despicable, comparisons of AMLO to Donald Trump. And I think, and we'll be going in a little bit to one of the worst offenders of this, The Economist, and their contemporary coverage of AMLO. But could you just sort of set the stage as to why AMLO's election was such a shock, and also too why there was such a negative reaction in a lot of mainstream media in the U.S. and abroad?
Sure. So when AMLO wins the presidency in 2018 on his third campaign. He'd previously run for president in 2006 and had won and had had it stolen from him. And then again in 2012. It was the first victory of a center-left candidate in Mexico, arguably since the 1930s with Lázaro Cárdenas in the post-revolutionary period. There had been not even a center-left government since then. And it was an overwhelming victory. AMLO won with 53% of the vote. He defeated the candidates of both the PRI, the former party of state, the former hegemonic party of state, and the PAN, the conservative party, by about points, clear and away. And Morena won the majority in both houses of Congress, which is what they're defending in the elections on Sunday.
And just to say, that was 30 points, because I think you got cut off.
Oh, it was 30 points. Yeah, sorry about that. So it was an extraordinary victory in terms of numbers, especially with everything that AMLO has had against him. He's had almost a uniform wall of both national and international press against him, and a structure of we can talk about this later too, a national election institute, which is also hostile to Morena. And I think it's important to point out that Morena had only been founded in 2014. It's an extraordinarily new party. I mean, imagine a party being founded 7 years ago and then winning the presidency and winning both houses of Congress. The PAN has been in existence since the late 30s, the PRI in different formations since the revolution 100 years ago. So it's extraordinary that AMLO left the PRD, which kind of imploded kind of along the lines of the US Democrats. He got out of there, formed a new party, is helped by the fact that Mexico has public financing for parties. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible. Formed a new party. They contended the elections in 2015, took a first step, and then 2018 wins the presidency. It's an extraordinarily quick rise for a fledgling party.
And it very much relied on, on mass movement building and base building and getting people out. I mean, I remember some of the things that really pissed off a lot of the more like centrist commentators about AMLO was his use of, kind of direct democracy and polls and things like that. I remember there was a big freak out about, I can't remember if it was Mexico City or not, but an expansion that had been planned to an airport there that was really, really expensive. And he put out a poll to folks there who said, they didn't want to spend all this public money on an airport. And, people in The Economist are very worked up about this development, right? But so he comes in on this wave of, of popular support. How has AMLO governed in his first few years in office?
It's, as I wrote in my recent piece in the Jacobin, there have been some solid advances in these first 3 years. Mexico is not what it was in 2018. I think it's important to kind of set the stage because I think a lot of English language commentary on Mexico leaves out what happened before this, where Mexico was. In the 1980s, Mexico went through a wholesale privatization, not quite as far as Chile, but pretty far. Over 1,000 state agencies were privatized. throughout the 80s and 90s on the heels of the peso devaluation of 82, which ushered in the neoliberal era. So that means the airlines, that means the banks, that means all of the major institutions went through a period of privatization. So you get that in the 80s and 90s. And then in the 90s, NAFTA comes in, right? And then you have another devaluation in 94, the tequila crisis. NAFTA opens the door, and then which devastates the countryside, and then floods, the market with, American junk food and all the rest, creating this massive health crisis and obesity problem that Mexico suffers now. Then by the 2000s, Mexico had degenerated into an absolute kleptocracy, and that's no exaggeration. There was this new generation of multimillionaires who had become rich overnight on the backs of the privatization of the Mexican state. Carlos Slim, who was for a time the richest man in the world, got Telmex and also Telcel, the phone companies. So what they do is they just privatize one thing after another to their crony friends, and then that would then be funneled back into the PRI and the PAN, this duopoly. And the idea was just to pass the ball back and forth forever between two right-wing parties and call that democracy, and trust that the international press would go along with that and say, sure, Mexico has been open to democracy because another right-wing party, took power. So Mexico went through an extraordinary series of shocks. And then on top of that, in 2006, this so-called drug war comes on with Felipe Calderon, which has caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people directly and indirectly, and has torn apart the social fabric of the country. So you're talking about a public that's gone through two massive devaluations and then a third slow motion devaluation. The peso devalued another 100% over the last 20 years, little by little, has had their entire state practically privatized, has had the countryside and their farming system devastated by NAFTA, and then has had their energy sector privatized in the 2010s, which created a whole new wave of dependency, making Mexico dependent on imported gasoline from the United States and imported foodstuffs from the United States, through NAFTA and other things. So it made Mexico prostrate and at the hands of a criminal enterprise that was running this country. So it's no exaggeration to talk about a combination of state capture on one hand. These interests had captured the state, and every state decision was being made in their kleptocratic interests, and state terror at the same time, using the terror of the so-called drug war to go after any attempts at organizing against them. So it's extraordinary that this is usually left out of the equation, right? Mexico, what AMLO is trying to do right now is dismantle something along the lines of Mani Puliti in Italia and Lava Jato in Brazil, which of course, as we know, was twisted in a political direction. But the Mexican press doesn't, Mexican press doesn't either, and to a large extent, but the international press doesn't touch this because the previous governments were doing what the US and the World Bank wanted. And they were, privatizing, they were opening up the energy sector. So they turned a blind eye to these things. And actually, the United States was complicit in this, all the way down the line.
And I wanted to hit, sorry, is this coming from me?
Yeah, I think a little bit of feedback from you.
All right, hold on one second.
This is more of a comment. If you can mute yourself, David. Yeah, okay, that's gone. No, is that me? That's me. Sorry, David. You take over, and I'm going to try to figure out what's going on with me.
Sorry about that. We're using a new system tonight. Because the privatization of power is really important, right? And I wanted to get to that because we opened up the show today talking about privatization schemes in the United States and across the world, and how this really is starting to become more and more of a fight for left-wing governments, populist movements, trying to reclaim control of these industries. AMLO now is in the middle of a huge fight over the Electric Industry Act, if I'm correct.
Right.
Could you explain what that is and why the right wing and capital has been fighting him so hard, and how they're fighting against?
Sure. So in 2013, 2014, the PRI government under Peña Nieto passed privatization, part privatized Pemex, which is the state oil industry, and has also been working on privatizing the electricity system under the Federal Electricity Commission. So the effects of that have been, remember that Mexico, it's important to point out, Mexico is an oil producing country. It has plenty of its own, Mexico has been blessed or cursed with an abundance of natural resources. So it has oil, it has natural gas, it has wind in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, it has water in Chiapas, it has lithium in Sonora, which is a big thing now as to what they're going to do with that and how they're going to get at it. So Pemex was opened to private investment, with the result that Mexico became dependent on the importation of gasoline and natural gas from, guess where? Texas.
Yeah. Which we helped you all out a lot during the winter storm, right?
Right. So in February, when Texas goes off the grid, 4 million people in Mexico go off the grid, right? Like, well, what the hell, right? What does Texas have to do with us? And I think that's when people really woke up to the extent to which this privatization of the energy system has, Mexico now imports somewhere between 60 and 70% of its gasoline, which has come down over the last few years. So the United States could simply turn off the spigots of its refineries and have Mexico prostrate. So how can you operate an independent foreign policy or an independent policy of any kind when you're dependent on another country, especially an empire like the United States, for your energy and for your food? It would be one thing if Mexico didn't have natural resources. There are some countries that don't and have to import, but Mexico does. And this has been a deliberate attempt to sabotage Mexico's own energy production. A fifth of Mexico's natural gas is simply burned off. It's simply burned off at the source, while they've negotiated these very juicy contracts to import natural gas. There was one ridiculous contract back in the 2000s where Felipe Calderon made a deal with Spain, which has no natural gas, to import natural gas from Peru to Mexico instead of using Mexico's own gas. So it became a big scam. So what this new law says very succinctly is that in our grid, in the national grid, public sources of energy have to be used first, and then private sources. So you have to use the public sources first. So for example, Mexico has a lot of hydroelectric power in the East Coast and the South. Those hydroelectric dams were sitting idle or largely idle. And so a few years ago in Tabasco, there was a huge problem with flooding, in large part because the dams were just sitting there idle. They weren't being. And they're refurbishing the dams now. So the law says clearly we have to use public sources of energy first. Iberdrola, Repsol, all these Spanish companies and American, interests went crazy about it and used the argument of environmentalism, right? Now, environmentalism is supremely important, and AMLO's environmental record can be criticized, but it was a very duplicitous argument, because what they're trying to do is protect their own private interest and their own access to subsidies and their own privileged access to Mexico's grid, wherein they would get the first crack at the grid, they'd get subsidies, and then they'd, a lot of these times, would be able to sell energy off to cherry pick who they'd sell the energy to. So they could sell off to corporations and such. So it wasn't like this energy is going to small communities where it should be going. So that's the law. AMLO first tried to pass it by executive order. It was bounced back by the courts. They passed a law, and within 24 hours, foreign multinationals got an injunction in the court. This is part of an ongoing lawfare strategy against a lot of things AMLO is trying to do. A labeling law for processed foods, the airport project that you mentioned, a lot of important things are being gummed up in the courts constantly through a lawfare process, through this Council of Strategic Litigation, which is run by Claudio X Gonzalez, who is the head opponent of AMLO in these elections, conveniently is financed by the United States through USAID, who's effectively paying his salary to be able to play all these games.
I mean, it's really incredible to see like the development of lawfare as a tactic just across the hemisphere, and also these kind of pseudo environmental arguments. I agree. Like there are like legitimate concerns and questions you could make about how environmentalist almost presidency has been. But it's like the same thing with Evo Morales. That people are saying like Evo Morales isn't green enough, so we support the coup, right? It's like it's trotted out at the most absurd times to serve the worst abusers of the environment, and so not only though is the lawfare being targeted against AMLO's policies, they were trying to use it against Morena, right? Coming into these elections on June 6th, correct?
Well, the problem with what's going on in that is, I think it's important to point out that, knock on wood, I don't want to jinx it, but Morena's looking pretty good for the elections on Sunday. And if you've been reading the English language press over the last 3 years, you'd have to wonder why, because according to the Anglophone press, AMLO has done nothing right? He's an autocrat who's bringing Mexico back to the 70s, and he's, bringing Mexico to ruin. And then surprisingly, his coalition is set to win on Sunday, despite a year of a pandemic and all of the pressures he's faced. So I think if you're, an English language reader, you'd be forgiven for asking, what are they not telling me? Or just fall back on the argument that, oh, he's a populist and he tricks people, right? He tricks people into voting for him, as populists do. That's been the shallow nature of the coverage. So the National Electoral Institute, Mexico has a National Electoral Institute which oversees and administers elections. It's not like the states, the US. On paper, that's a good thing. In practice, however, it's run by holdovers from previous conservative administrations. And doing everything they possibly could to try to tip the scales against Morena and the elections. Now, Morena has had some questionable candidates that they've nominated, and that's something to be discussed, right? But all of a sudden, the INE arguing that they didn't file expense reports for primary campaigns, or a technicality of that part, eliminated 49 Morena candidacies right at the beginning of their campaign. They just said, right, you're out, including 2 candidates for governor. I mean, they just wiped out candidacies. So that's a, so Morena had to go back and, find new candidates right as the campaign season was beginning. Whereas, conservative candidates up and down the country are, attempting to buy elections through these debit cards. Electoral buying has become a thing. And by these debit cards, which they hand out to voters and say, if you win, you'll get money on this card, right? Which is clearly illegal. But, the INE is see no evil, hear no evil when it's convenient for them. And then they've also tried to fiddle with the proportional representation mechanism, which is a little bit arcane, but basically Mexico has 300 seats are going to be elected by single member districts, and 200 more seats are allotted through proportional representation. Basically a last minute switcheroo to try to make sure that Morena would have fewer seats and try to prevent them from getting a majority. So it's gotten to the point where the head of the National Electoral Institute, Lorenzo Cordova, has said, "Oh, we can cancel the elections. Basically, we can cancel elections because the president in his press conferences has gotten involved in the campaign and other things. So we have the right to cancel elections where we want," which is worrying. It's worrying when you have the head of the National Electoral Institute talking about canceling elections. Maybe not the whole election, but certain strategic elections, taking them to the electoral tribunal. So Sunday is just the beginning. And so, as you're right, it's a kind of lawfare in the electoral sphere.
And this is a pretty large election too, right? I mean, obviously there's like the congressional ones, but if I understand correctly, it's seats all across local governments as well too, right? So like them throwing the wrench in Morena's ability to select candidates really is a huge issue when you're having to find people to
right.
run in all of these different seats.
Yeah, these are going to be the largest one-day elections in the history of Mexico. So it's 15 governorships. Morena is looking to win more than half of them as things look now. The entire lower house of Congress, 500 seats. Morena is poised to win a majority. And if they have a really good day, and again, I don't want to jinx anything, I've got these political superstitions, their coalition is even inching close to winning a 2/3 majority with which they could pass constitutional reforms on their own without having to negotiate with other parties, if they have a good day. So they're in that range. Plus several thousand other state legislatures. Where I am in Oaxaca, the state legislature is up. A lot of mayorships. They've condensed elections all onto one day, which used to be spread out, which is a good idea, actually. So that's what's going to be going on Sunday.
And I'm just curious, is that so? This was actually deliberate to sort of have all the elections be at one time, so more people would show up, essentially.
Yeah, to make it easier to administer. They fiddled with the links of certain administrations to kind of synchronize everything, so that they'd have more elections on one day to kind of do it all in one shot. That was the idea. And turnout, we'll see. Turnout in off-year elections is, as in many countries, lower than in presidential elections. But curiously, that actually would tend to help Morena. Usually that helps the right. In this case, that helps Morena as the governing party, because right-wing parties which have run a terrible campaign, a terrible campaign, and that's helped Morena too. The class hatred against Morena and AMLO has really been something to see. You put in your graphic for our talk, why do the rich hate AMLO, right? On paper, really, they have no reason to hate AMLO, actually. Mexico has come out of the COVID recession. The economy is predicted to grow between 5% and 7% this year, doing very well. The vaccine program is doing very well. Mexico is 9th in the world in the number of vaccines administered. And what I think is good with that is that Mexico didn't wait for Biden and Europe to donate vaccines or lift the pharmaceutical monopoly on that. They went out and got vaccines from Russia and China. They went out there, moved. So stock market is up. The billionaires got much richer in Mexico as they got richer in the U.S. during the pandemic. So on paper they've got nothing to complain about. But it's an extraordinary class hatred against AMLO. It's just extraordinary. They hate him as a person, and that oozes out of everything they say. He comes from Tabasco. He has an accent. They don't like how he wears his suits. A journalist, Hernan Gomez, went to Polanco, the richest district of Mexico City, the other day, and was interviewing people as to AMLO. It was really very illuminating. AMLO has no class. He doesn't speak English. He pronounces foreign words poorly. He doesn't go on foreign junkets and shine at international summits like former presidents do. He doesn't. He practically never travels abroad. His concern is Mexico and Mexican sovereignty. He doesn't wing around the world on Mexico's version of Air Force One. They're actually selling it off. So it's a class hatred, and that has penetrated the way they've run a campaign, because everything their commentators have said has just oozed with this irrational, visceral class hatred, which is palpable. And it's made it impossible for them to just articulate a clear argument or a clear version of what a right-wing government would do besides steal, which is what the previous administrations did, and that's been very much to Morena's benefit.
And just on that question is the class nature of Morena. I know as a party it's sort of interesting and is diverse, but how would you describe the kind of class politics of Morena and AMLO so far? Because there's obviously AMLO certainly is doing a lot of things where he's he's getting rid of the kind of pomp and circumstance of the president, right? As you're saying, and all that stuff is great, and I can see why it's appealing. But I'm sure there's also a lot that he's doing for working people and poor people as well, that's improving their conditions too. That's catching the ear of the super wealthy.
Yeah. The important thing is he set up a series of transfer programs, direct transfer programs for people. And that includes stay in school scholarships for students of all ages. If you stay in school and you go to public schools, you'll get a a scholarship, a pension program, a nationwide pension program, which will now be 65 and over. Mexico never had these things. He started a pension program when he was mayor of Mexico City. Small business aid, aid to farmers, price supports. And right, these are the programs that the rich, are looking at and saying, well, he just need to buy support and buy elections, which is always the argument being used whenever these programs are instituted. And it's funny that when COVID hit, the financial press went into a tizzy because AMLO wouldn't go into debt. All of a sudden it was the Financial Times, which is always tut-tutting and criticizing people, leaders around the world, saying, oh, you've got to maintain austerity and don't go into debt. All of a sudden they're saying AMLO's not going into debt. He should be going into debt. He should be subsidizing companies. What they didn't realize is that these transfer programs were doing a lot of that work. So I know of families in Mexico where, the students would be receiving the scholarships, maybe a grandparent would be receiving the pension, and maybe another member of the family would be receiving a small business support, these tandas para el bienestar or other programs. And that helped a lot of families through the worst of that, of the COVID crisis, right? We can discuss AMLO's fiscal policy, but, AMLO sees all of this through the lens of national sovereignty. I think there are two key events in AMLO's life that we can, there's a lot, but the first is when he was a freshman in college, which is a pretty important time. I think we can all remember. That was overthrown in Chile in 1970. He was a freshman at the UNAM, and that made an incredible impression on his generation. And the major question is, how does a center-left take power without being overthrown? Because it doesn't take you being a socialist for the United States to overthrow you. Any moderately center-left government is ripe for a coup in the history of Latin America. Even the most moderate, Goulart in Brazil, if you look at Arbenz in Guatemala, even just straying from the line a little bit, right? Honduras, right? All he wanted to do was add another ballot question, a non-binding referendum question for the Constitution, and he was, rushed out of the country in his pajamas. Right, in the middle of the night. So, how do you take power and maintain power and achieve change? And the other big event was in 1982 was the devaluation. So everything AMLO sees, I think, is through the lens of Mexican national sovereignty, right? And he doesn't want to go into debt precisely because he knows that then puts the country at the mercy of the IMF and the World Bank, which then, give you loans, but then require structural reforms. And then they're in there. Then they're in the door, and you can't get them out, and it becomes a spiral. So he's been criticized, and I think rightly so, for running a very tight fiscal ship. I think that's to be looked at, but it's not because I think he's ideologically a neoliberal, because he doesn't want to be in hock to the IMF and the World Bank.
Which is a very legitimate, position to have. I mean, I know I've been having, personally, when I talk to people, what's happening in Mexico, especially because in the U.S. there's, such big fights about, deficit and deficit spending as necessarily a progressive value. Again, I'm not even defending. I would argue that AMLO's fixation on debt can be a little bit harmful, but I also understand where it originates from. Instead of just sort of putting sloppy labels on him, like people call him a neoliberal. But hell, we also have people who are, trying to tie him together with Trump. And I don't know, do you have something that
he's a neoliberal and a populist
at the same time?
He's everything.